Thank you. There are lots of copies of my paper outside. And what I'm not going to do is just give you a quick summary of the paper so you don't have to go and read it. What I want to do is make some more or some additional points. Let me begin by saying this. I'm a lawyer, and lawyers love rules. Actually, large companies also like rules. Large companies like rules because rules create barriers to entry. If there are lots of complicated rules that you need an army of lawyers or compliance officers to help you navigate, it's very difficult for somebody with a new idea to set up in competition with you. We have hundreds of thousands of pages of rules dealing with banking. Rules have failed us. In England we have an expression, you can't see the wood for the trees. The expression refers to when you're concentrating on so hard on the detail, on the trees, that you fail to see the overall shape of things. The wood, i.e. the forest. One of the joys of flying into Amsterdam was just being able to see from above what it looks like. And we have hundreds of lawyers, thousands of lawyers and compliance officers running around in banking for 2 decades, coming up with more and more complicated rules, and yet they managed to spot some fairly fundamental things that were happening. In a globalized economy, we no longer had separate capital markets, which meant that global banks would always be able to borrow somewhere. We just had one market. And that we were transferring what was supposed to be shock absorbers to help minimize risk into amplifiers which spread and expanded risk. Nobody spotted this before the crisis happened. Banking regulation over the last 20 years has been an object lesson in failing to see the wood for the trees. Basel, Brussels, London and New York produced thousands and thousands of pages of detailed rules which not only failed to prevent the greatest financial crisis for nearly a century, they exacerbated rather than mitigating its consequences. I'm a Christian. I think nothing works well unless we have personal integrity. Lawyers in England are still made to do something that is called professional ethics as part of our training. In France, they'd call it déontologie. This idea that if you are going into a profession, if you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer, part of what they teach you is not just the skills that you need to be able to do the job, but the professional values that you are supposed to uphold. I didn't see our business schools teaching bankers about how to be professional in banking. I understand one of the changes I think the Netherlands has done since the financial crisis is to introduce kind of banker's oath, like the oath that doctors are supposed to take. And I think that's a really good initiative. I'm afraid that in England, before the financial crisis, the heroes that you looked up to were people like Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas in the film Wall Street, or maybe Leonardo DiCaprio in the film The Wolf of Wall Street. These were supposed to be warnings, but they were taken by the men running the banks to be examples to aim for. Now, there were a reasonable number of people of personal integrity working in the City of London before the financial crisis. Some fairly prominent people. Stephen Green, chairman of HSBC, an Anglican priest. Ken Costa, chairman of UBS and chairman of Alpha International. There were lots of Christians and other people with personal integrity working in the financial system before the crisis, and yet they did not prevent the system from going rotten. I'm British, but also, it should be said, Irish. This is my personal plan for dealing with Brexit, is to go and get my Irish passport sorted out.
Welcome back in the community.
Thank you. The British have pursued over the last 30 years a model of capitalism built on the idea that the sole motivation for a company is the promotion of shareholder value. Somehow, through the single-minded pursuit of this sole goal, all other social benefits will be achieved more efficiently than if they had been correctly targeted. This is the kind of ideas of Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics that the British took to heart under Mrs. Thatcher. In the decade before the financial crisis, the pursuit of shareholder value became about demonstrating constantly increasing profits, quarter upon quarter upon quarter. Now, the pursuit of short-term profits turned out, entirely unsurprisingly, to be a particularly inapt goal for the banking industry. Since banking is fundamentally about maturity transformation, providing long-term loans which are financed by liabilities repayable in the short term. If you stand back and ask what the industry is about, it's about converting the short term into the long term. So how should you measure up the success of a bank? You should measure it over the long term, not how things are going this quarter. So, Calum mentioned in his presentation earlier about convincing businesses that strong relationships are key to long-term profits. I think we actually have to start our education back a stage, which is to convince businesses to aim for long-term profit in the first place. Now, I therefore like the model of financial services provided either by a partnership, in which the owners are also the directors, or by a mutual society, like a building society or a cooperative. In England, all but one of our large building societies converted from cooperatives to become limited liability companies. Every single one that did so had to be bailed out by the government. The one large building society which did not convert nationwide survived the financial crisis without needing a bailout. So I became very interested in that. I did mention that I am Irish, and I went to Ireland last week, not just so I was able to come up with an answer to your question about whether the interest rate is too low, but I will come back to that. But it was very interesting to be in Ireland and to talk to a number of people involved in the financial system there. One of the most interesting people I talked to was employed by Rabobank, a Dutch cooperative, which had a different approach because it was a cooperative, because it doesn't pay large bonuses, because it thinks quite carefully about how it organises itself. And he said his experience compared from working at RBS to working at Rabobank was that in RBS he felt disrespected every day he was at work, whereas at Rabobank he felt respected. Now, just watching your reactions as I mentioned Rabobank, I saw the smiles and the sniggers. Because, of course, despite its cooperative status, and despite its clear social mission statement, available in English as well as in Dutch on its website, Rabobank did get caught up with the British bank Lloyds Bank in manipulating Japanese yen LIBOR submissions, and Rabobank's Irish subsidiary became involved in the lending which funded the Irish property bubble and went bust. Yeah. So, that's very interesting because it's an indication that it's not just enough to have people of goodwill in a system in order to make the system work, and it's actually not enough just to have some institutions which are operating differently. Shortly before the crisis happened, the chief executive of Citigroup asked about whether his business felt affected by market rumours that were going around in the summer of 2007, said this: "When the music is playing, you have to get up and dance." His explanation was, even when you know that there is a bubble in asset prices happening, even when you know that the profits that are being generated are not sustainable, if everybody else is doing it, you have to do it as well. And that was Rabobank's experience in Ireland. Because of its structure, Rabobank decentralises. It has a regional approach to dealing with its businesses. And Rabobank's business in Ireland looked at Anglo-Irish Bank, which was generating double-digit profits, nearly 20% return on equity. And they thought, well, even though we're a cooperative business, if it's that easy to make money here, we ought to be doing it as well. In fact, it's almost impossible to resist that. You might be right in the long term, but the reality is that your shareholders and your members will probably have lost patience with your strategy before the long term comes around. It is all but impossible to chart a completely different course in a marketplace which promotes the use of debt to inflate profits, and which allows banks to privatise their profits, but to pass their losses on to the public. And that's what has happened. We don't have capitalism in banking. We don't have capitalism in banking. What we have that we need from banks, or we need from somebody at least, is we need a payment system. We need a means of being able to pay for the things that we have. And what banks have managed to do very successfully is to trade on the back of the fact that they know that governments will keep that payment system going almost at all costs. And what we fail to do is to say, well, that's the bit that we really need to deal with. We need to make sure the payment system is safe, and we also need to look after people's money that they have for this month's bills. But we've allowed ourselves to not just protect that, but protect all the other things that banks are doing. If you look back over the last 30 years, you will see that the average bank has got bigger in size, but the biggest banks have got bigger faster than all the others. Because the biggest banks knew something that the rest of us didn't discover until it was too late, which was that if you are too big to fail, that gives you an advantage in the marketplace. Because you can basically borrow as much as the market thinks that the state or states that are going to bail you out can afford. So we saw Ireland turn its bank's debts into its own debts. But we saw through rescues of things like Fortis and Dexia and other banks, we now know that the biggest banks know that certainly on the European stage, they can borrow as much as the ECB is able to finance. Well, absolutely. Now that means that we've got a series of skewed incentives. If I'm a banker, I'm able to borrow more cheaply than anybody else because of the government guarantee that I'm not paying for, by the way, or not really paying for. I can then bank a series of profits if things work out well. And if things go badly, well, in England, if things go badly, you have to hand back your knighthood. And you might have to reduce your pension from £750,000 a year to £500,000 a year. Well, those were the consequences for Fred Goodwin of buying ABN AMRO at a price that nobody could afford, and various other things that were done. But that's it. So if you look at kind of basic risk and reward, you'd be mad as a banker not to go chasing the risky money, because the reward is so great and the downside is so limited. We need to realise that that is not necessary. Somehow, without anybody really noticing, without it being talked about, banking changed dramatically over the last 30 years. There are some basic tools that exist that could bring banks back down to size. And we need to do it because these big institutions are not only too big to fail, they are now too big to bail. We used up all the tools in the toolbox fixing banking last time. Whether interest rates are currently too low or not, they can't go any lower. Many governments cannot take on any more debt, at least not without seriously compromising the prosperity of future generations. Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, the British Central Bank, during the apparent boom before the crisis, has now gone into academia and has said, this is where we are a decade on. Even though the largest banks in the biggest financial centres in the advanced world failed, triggering a worldwide collapse of confidence and the deepest recession since the 1930s, nothing much has really changed in terms of the fundamental structure of the Western banking industry. Without reform of the financial system, another crisis is certain, sooner rather than later. Financial crises are always certain. I think economists have predicted 9 out of the last 5 financial crises that have occurred recently. What was surprising was not that there was a financial crisis, it was the amplifier effects. It was the way in which a property collapse in the USA and in Ireland and Spain spread and hit everybody. Without reform, it will be the young of today who suffer, and the human and economic costs of that crisis will be bigger than last time. So radical change is needed, not simply by turning back the clock, but by recognising the marketplace in which banks operate is artificial, it is one we can and must control, and it is one where we need to simplify things and take things back and recognise we need change at all sorts of levels, the institutional level, the legal level and the personal level.